Welcome to the Web3 Wisdom Podcast, the frontier where vision meets reality in the digital world. Join us as we navigate the ever evolving landscape of blockchain, cryptocurrencies, and the decentralized web. In each episode, we dive deep into the minds of pioneers, innovators, and thought leaders. And now, here is your host, Vijay Praveen Maharajan. I'm the founder and CEO of bitsCrunch. And today we have Yat Siu, the trailblazer in the blockchain revolution. So let's unpack the complexities of Web3 and transform into insights you act on right here on Web3 Wisdom Podcast. Here we go. Hey, hi, Yat Siu. Thanks a lot for joining in for the Web3 Wisdom Podcast. You have been my inspiration and an inspiration to several other Web3 entrepreneurs, Web3 builders in the space. Great to have you on the podcast, and thanks for agreeing to be on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here.
Yep. So would want the first question to be really something that people have not heard a lot, right? So bitsCrunch, we are sort of headquartered in Munich, Germany, and we have spotted that you have a long history with Vienna, Austria, and also Germany. So please share your initial days, rolling us back to the Vienna days and also Germany.
Yeah, sure. Going back a little bit of memory lane here, but so I was born in Vienna, Austria, to parents of basically artists and musicians. For those of you who may not know, Austria has always been, particularly Vienna, has always been considered a sort of classical music capital in some sorts, with the Vienna Philharmonic, the Staatsoper, and sort of, the art, sort of a conservatory and music conservatory. And as a result of that, I also ended up studying music. That's, as good Asian parents do to their children. It's like you enter somewhat into their footsteps, and everything you've heard about sort of Asian tiger parenting, it's all true. Anyway, as a result of that, I ended up studying classical music. And from that, in the early days, really, it was interesting as an experience because, I was born in the 70s, so definitely dating myself. And so between the 70s and the 80s, there weren't a lot of Asian guys, basically, in Vienna, or frankly speaking, in really Europe for that matter, especially Central Europe. And most of them were really immigrating, especially during the time of the Cultural Revolution, and afterwards, with the official handover from in Hong Kong. Many of those groups ended up mostly going to the UK. So it was a bit more of an oddity to find sort of, let's call it, Asian immigrants, certainly in Vienna. I think Berlin was a little bit different, particularly the eastern side, because of the whole back then, I guess, when there was still a division between Eastern Europe, the whole sort of, I guess, particularly the Vietnamese and sort of Chinese communities that ended up going there. So it was a bit different there. But anyway, that experience was interesting because in some ways I was someone who kind of looked from the world from the inside out. I mean, I speak German fluently. Effectively, I think it is my mother tongue. But I was always a little bit on the outside, although I was never really sort of witnessing, I would say, like any hostility in the classic sense. It was more oddity. It was more like, oh, where you're from, and like I don't know about you, right? And so it was a bit of a sort of a difference in that way. But as a result, also, I would say it was the connections that I ended up making a lot of actually ended up being online as opposed to purely physical through an early online service called CompuServe. And I wasn't particularly good at music in comparison to many of my fellow colleagues who were much, much more talented than me. And music is one of those things where, if you have talent, you can absolutely tell. And I ended up basically writing composition software on an Atari computer. An Atari computer had MIDI ports, so it was easy to connect the keyboard, and it was just easier for me to write music this way. My teachers weren't very impressed because, remember, back then, I mean, for those who do remember, in the 80s, you even using a calculator was considered cheating. So never mind using a computer that will basically teach you how to, not teach you, but basically help you with music writing and notation software. I mean, can you just imagine what people would have thought about AI in the 80s, right? It would have just completely blown their minds. Anyways, that's kind of sort of what happened then. But I uploaded the software onto CompuServe, and in CompuServe, which is like this pre-internet service, people came to me and appreciated the software and said, "Hey, this is really useful for me, and I could use it too." And they ended up sending me money, basically in the mail, because back then there was no PayPal, right? There was no online payment services, so you literally send a check. And I was a kid, so I didn't have a bank account yet. But that was sort of the first indication where I ended up making really meaningful relationships, I guess, online, and also getting appreciation from people who didn't care, how old I was or where I'm from or even what my background is. They just appreciated me for what I was able to do. And through that, I got an opportunity to ultimately work for Atari, who sought me out because of what I did. And they had a sort of one-man office in representative office in Vienna, but really it was part of Atari Germany. And for those who don't remember, Atari Germany, basically the headquarters for Atari back then in the 80s was a very different beast from the one in Sunnyvale in the US. They were a subsidiary, but unlike the US entity that was more focused on, I guess, sort of gaming, the European entity was much more focusing on basically a sort of word processing and actually a sort of, in this case, music notation eventually, and sort of desktop publishing, right? It was actually really more a cheaper alternative to the Apple Mac because it had the monochrome screen. And the popular computer at the time was the, Atari ST. So that was, for those who remember in the old original German days, the Atari ST was the more serious computer versus the Commodore Amiga, which was basically more of the gaming entertainment computer and the sort of, and then with the video toaster, the ability to sort of do editing and video editing and so on. So there was kind of two different types of computers that were back then. I describe that age a little bit as sort of the romantic age of computing because people had sort of it was quite diverse, right? The IBM machines were still very early. It was really the Mac was kind of high end. But anyway, it brought me into this whole universe. And of course, back then there was no formal computer science education. There was no formal sort of approaches to this. It was very early. We were all sort of learning on the fly, and I would argue none of us really knew, what we are doing. We were literally just tinkering, experimenting. But of course, as a result of that, I think we gained a lot of knowledge about interactions, about sort of the future of software and the future of compute, and frankly, the future of online, even if it was done more subconsciously. So we just existed in it, right? It was just comfortable online. I made friends online. I communicated that way, and eventually that brought me to the US and eventually to Hong Kong to end up building one of Hong Kong's very first internet service providers and effectively I guess, entrepreneurial career.
Awesome. I mean, that's that's literally giving me goosebumps from immigrating to a different country, different continent, and then back in days, even like you said, using a calculator was felt different, right? So from there, and then having a musical background in the family, how did you get into Web3? What was the real aha moment for you?
So I would say the interest and the fascination of Web3, I think, was only possible because of my various experiences that I've had over the last 30 to 40 years, at least the way that I interpreted it. So I didn't enter Web3, because of Bitcoin. Bitcoin came out effectively in 2009, and I heard about it, and I did sort of look at it, but because it was so financial in nature, it was born really out of a financial sort of rebellion, shall we say. It didn't appeal to us in a big way. Also, in 2009, we were just in the middle of selling our messaging business, our cloud computing, cloud business to IBM, which is well publicized at this point. And that meant that we were just really occupied on our particular transaction as opposed to other things. And as a result of that, really the whole sort of blockchain crypto movement kind of passed us by. But really what got us into it was CryptoKitties. Our studio in Vancouver called Fuel Powered was actually involved in building basically CryptoKitties. And the one who was running it, basically Mick, ended up becoming a co-founder of what eventually became Dapper Labs. And when we saw that, we said, "Oh, well, not only do we need to become investors, please also make us publishers of basically sort of CryptoKitties, which we ended up becoming very early on." I'm just giving you an idea. CryptoKitties basically launched in November of 2017, late November. And we ended up announcing a partnership and publishing in January of 2018, right? So literally it was just like, not even 2 whole months where we ended up basically sort of concluding and putting the whole thing together, just to give you an idea of how quick we were about this. But I would say what fascinated us was less the financial construct, but the fact that we could actually have true digital ownership, sort of this whole vision around digital property rights. And why that came about was really coming from the original vision of the internet, which was so appealing to us, was information democracy and the whole idea that we could basically access information freely and that we had knowledge available to all. That was kind of the initial promise of the internet. And one of the constructs that still survives to this day that's so powerful is open source, right? So we were big open source proponents. We were one of the largest Linux deployments back in the early 2000s, for instance. So we're always big supporters of that. And then we ended up going into sort of the age of Web2 with basically social media, particularly with things like Facebook and Instagram and and eventually TikTok and so on. And we basically saw the opposite of what was happening in Web1, which was basically control of these platforms, where basically the data and data paradigm ended up being centralized and controlled by these platforms, where suddenly we went from an open and free internet to a closed and controlled internet. And that was a problem for us. We didn't like that. And we were, in fact, victims of it ourselves, having been deplatformed by Apple, actually, because they didn't like some of our marketing practices, although they never really told us. So we're just making an assumption, because that's what happens when you exist in a despotic environment. They can remove you and do whatever they want to you without actually having to explain their reasons. They just do it, right? And we're not the only ones that obviously have suffered from this, right? I mean, big companies like Epic, with Fortnite, or even individuals who have lost their X handle or music handle or metaverse handle, whatever handle they thought they owned on these platforms, they lost them because basically the platform decided it was better for them to have it, right? So that was that experience. And so with Web3, we saw a way in which that actually would go back to the original promise of the internet, which is that actually it could be sort of more fairer, more freer, and more open, but with a different paradigm attached to it, which is one of ownership, which therefore then gives it a form of value. And I think this is where, it became really powerful in our thinking, because we began to understand that actually, even though we could have all this information and knowledge, this information and knowledge has to translate into something that is more powerful. And that translation ended up becoming one that's controlled by the platform. And now, basically in Web3, that translation can exist in the asset in and of itself, in the same way that property rights works in the real world, because of the way that network effects can form from that. And I think the other thing that influenced me, again, was the way I was brought up. So I grew up in Austria in the 70s and 80s. And for those who don't remember, Europe was divided between East and West. It was the Eastern Bloc, which was the sort of covered in what was known back then as the Iron Curtain, was basically, communist and essentially a Soviet bloc. And then you had the West. And in Vienna, being where the United Nations was, it was really kind of in the cross border between them. So we were always constantly sort of in the middle of this. And then my mom, she used to work at the Komische as well as part of her tours, and then which was in East Berlin. So I would visit her in the eastern side of Germany. And it was a stark contrast. For those who would remember those days or have witnessed them, it was literally walking into 1984. Like, you go from the West and you go to the East, and I'm suddenly in like a different land, and a different world. It's completely Orwellian. And it was something that, is hard to explain sometimes to people today, to say, this actually happened. And that's actually what real communism looks like, as opposed to what people think socialism is like. It's nothing like that, right? So these factors influenced me about thinking about the value of property rights and why sort of, I guess, we think capitalism is a good thing. But then having moved to the US, for work with Atari and then eventually a startup, I witnessed capitalism at an extreme, because American capitalism, particularly in the 90s, was very, very extreme. And then I went to Hong Kong, and Hong Kong was capitalism on steroids. It was even more capitalist in nature than even the US and certainly Europe. So I saw all the sort of, I guess, extreme sides of things and the problems that come from it, particularly when it comes to sort of what happens in the extreme form of capitalism that you witness in places like Hong Kong. I mean, Hong Kong didn't have social security up until maybe 20 years ago, for instance, and is probably the one place in the world that, despite its incredible wealth, has one of the worst, if not the worst, Gini coefficient in the world. So, which is basically how you measure sort of the delta between the most well-off and the least well-off. Which is incredible given the fact that Hong Kong is so wealthy, for instance. So you see sort of the darker side of an extreme form of capitalism as well. And that's actually, all these things combined is actually the reason why we became so fascinated in Web3, because we felt that one of the solutions to not just what we can do in gaming, but actually what we can do for the world, is to provide a way in which we can all be owners in the equity that we build, right? Which is basically, in this case, data. And if we can do that successfully, then we can actually redraw the world in a manner that is more fair and better for all, which I think is everyone's goal at the end of the day. It's just that people have trouble figuring that out, obviously. And so Web3 provides a way to do that, since we've become so digitally sort of dependent. So that's really sort of what drew us to Web3 in a big way.
Oh, amazing. I mean, to roll back and to roll back all these years across different continents. You're talking about Vienna, US, and Hong Kong. So such a tremendous journey. And I mean, talking about people FOMOing it, right? I mean, people use this term FOMO, fear of missing out in this space. But if I look back and see what you have done for CryptoKitties and Dapper Labs, oh my God! Back in days, people were not even sure about what is the capability, or uh, what CryptoKitties and Dapper Labs could potentially do in this space, right? Because they were like basically the pioneers in this space, and I'm really glad to hear that you had such a long-term vision, which is very important for every investors, right? So talking about investments, I mean, I'm sure everybody knows that you have invested more than 450 projects now, and some of your early projects, like for instance, you mentioned CryptoKitties, OpenSea, and then Dapper Labs, and so on. People know a lot of investments that you have done, but I'm not sure. Not a lot of them know that you also acquire companies, right? Maybe talk about some acquisitions that you did in the past, which sort of blew up.
Yeah, I mean, I would say probably the most well-known acquisition that we did, which was in 2018, was the Sandbox.
Mhm.
Sandbox was I guess, a Web2 metaverse at the time on mobile. That was, a strong team of developers in Argentina who had a vision, but obviously they were making traditional, I guess, games and world builder games. So it's a little bit like a Minecraft, but in a sort of very Web2 pixelated 2D dimensional way. And we sort of saw the potential to move them into basically a Web3, I guess, Minecraft on blockchain type of experience. That was really the model. And one of the reasons why we felt Minecraft was so ideal was partially because of voxels. Voxels is, a very sort of easy for user generated content. It's kind of a universal way in which you can easily create and build building blocks on top of each other in a kind of Lego kind of way, right? Because after all, Lego is very popular. But also, most people who are not in gaming don't appreciate that actually Minecraft is still the second most popular game in the world. It's more popular than PUBG, more popular than Minecraft. And the other game that's bigger than Minecraft is Roblox, right? So both of these games have one thing in common. They're user generated. And they basically are built on top of the creativity and ingenuity of its users, as opposed to an experience that is built by, I guess, game designers who then depend on their own sort of designs to make it fun and successful. Whereas Minecraft and Roblox really depend on the creativity of its players. And in a sense, it makes them not exactly co-owners, because in the Web2 paradigm, they don't own anything, but it does give them a sense of ownership because they're invested in it, right? They've built these environments. So the result, they feel a sense of ownership. And that's basically what we ended up sort of seeing that vision. And we acquired them in 2018 because, of course, for those of you who may not know, in 2018, it was one heck of a bear market. Like people talk about this being a bear market. Well, you've seen nothing in comparison to 2018, where essentially there was literally like, I think Bitcoin was like $3,000 at one point. Ethereum was floating at low hundreds at one point, going below 100. I think it was like $80, $85. I mean, we're talking about really rough times, right? That was basically the state of crypto back then. So people were already running away from I guess, fungible tokens. So here we are talking about non-fungible tokens, something that is less tradable and
Yeah.
less liquid in comparison. So obviously that was very, very hard. So the acquisition took place in 2018. And, obviously, we helped them, basically build up the business. And, the rest is history, I guess, literally, in the sense that Sandbox is probably the preeminent Web3 metaverse for the time being, and is, I guess, very much viewed as a benchmark in terms of, how is the health of Web3 and what's happening there. And obviously, they're building in this bear market, but still very successful. Growth metrics are very strong still. So we're excited about that. But we've made many investments in other metaverses because we do believe that there's going to be, multiple metaverses, just in the same way that there's going to be multiple cities and countries in any kind of sort of world. The other acquisition that we quite like as well, most recently, that we think has a lot of new kind of potential, not just in the gaming side, is TinyTap. So TinyTap is interesting because TinyTap basically focuses on education, and what TinyTap and Sandbox actually share is also user-generated content, right? Meaning that teachers, in this case, create content, and then they end up selling this content, basically as services to students or to other people, and they service close to 9 million families today. But what's interesting about TinyTap is that now teachers can create their content as NFTs, and this NFT could then be sold on to someone else who can then have the benefit of the revenues that generated from basically that NFT, from the ownership, and they can grow that business. Basically, it's like buying IP rights and all the royalties and licenses related to those IP rights. Essentially, creating a similar framework for teachers like you have for artists or musicians, which, I would say, really, if you think about it, teachers are probably amongst the biggest content creators in the world, but we don't treat them as content creators, right? We treat them as service providers, actually. Although actually they make content for our students every single day. And the things that both of them share is essentially a mass adoption strategy. Right? In the case of Sandbox, it was going after the gaming audiences that are familiar with things like Minecraft and Roblox, which is hundreds of millions of gamers. And in the case of TinyTap, it's going after students and teachers, which basically is, the vast majority of the world. Everyone needs to learn something. Everyone has to send their kids to some school and learn some learning content. And so again, the strategy is around how do we bring more people into Web3 and what are the tools to do so? So gaming and education are sort of, two examples. It's not limited to that, of course, right? We also have invested in art projects, and we've invested in sort of, DeFi as well, and sort of wallet companies, all of them sort of to try to grow the space. But I would say these are two examples where we think there'll be mass adoption.
Great. I mean, we have seen multiple bear and bull markets, and I guess you and Animoca Brands team have seen the most, especially in the non-fungible token space, right? Because deploying capital in a bull run is not a surprising thing, but deploying capital when the whole world was looking against an idea is something that is so great, and kudos to your earlier investments, kudos to your ongoing investments. I wish most of them, or if not all of them, turns so good in the future, which will eventually shape up the whole Web3 space, right? I mean, this is what exactly you were also talking about in the TED talk recently, right? Maybe you talked a lot about IP data, and could you please share the experience with TED? TED Talk is different from TEDx, right? Because TEDx is everywhere.
So
Everybody's host TEDx.
yeah,
Maybe you can share a
yes,
bit on your TED experience.
yes. So well, I think so. First of all, so the TED Talk, which was on main stage in Vancouver, is basically, I guess you could say, an official TED Talk. And whereas TEDx talks are the ones that are run by the community, which are also great. And one of the things about the TED Talk experience that was interesting for me was that I did not expect that so many people thought that the metaverse was essentially what Facebook was promoting, which is basically, the Meta's vision of essentially the metaverse with VR goggles and so on. So I had to sort of, present my talk in such a manner to people who really didn't have an idea of how we thought the metaverse was, which is one that we have digital property rights and ownership in, and that we actually get to own a part of the data, that blockchain is an integral part of the open metaverse. but most of them didn't know that. And that was fascinating for me because you would think that an audience like TED should know, right? Normally, you think, technology, entertainment, design, right? You think that they would be forward on this, but somehow they didn't. And what that taught me was that we in the Web3 world are actually a little bit in our own bubble, right? Meaning that we have to step out of our bubble in order to bring people in. We can't sit in our bubble and then say, why aren't you here? Or why we can't sit in our bubble and say, what's wrong with you? Like, why don't you see what I see? Like, that doesn't work, right? What we have to do is we have to step out and we have to tell people, look, let me help you explain why it's better. And so that was really sort of the whole point of the TED Talk, to express it in a manner that wasn't technical, but that was basically really drawing it from the philosophical and from the true purpose and meaning behind what it is if we actually get to own and have rights around our data. And so the TED Talk really focused on explaining how large the actual economies are of Web3, which is very large. I mean, at the time, I was talking about economies the size of Cyprus, but it's grown since. For instance, at the time when I gave the talk, DAOs basically had reserves of about $12 billion. And the most recent stats, actually, DAOs are close to 18. I think it's 17.8 or $17.9 billion in their reserves. And it's grown. And this is in the bear market, right? Most people would imagine that DAO reserves would shrink, but it's the opposite, right? And DeFi is still, the total value locked in DeFi, it's in the, sort of 60, $70 billion range, give or take, which is basically the size of national banks, like Greece, for instance, right? So the transactions as well that are happening in DeFi are north of $100 billion a month, for instance. I mean, these are major, major economies, right? I mean, if you were to add all of that, including the fact that it's over $1 trillion worth of combined asset value, basically in all of the digital assets, we're talking about an economy that would be amongst some of the biggest countries in the world if you added it all up together. Certainly, I would say in the top 50 at this point. If you were calculating that in a sort of GDP nation state kind of way. And of course, I recognize that that's imperfect, but I was just trying to illustrate that this space actually continues to grow despite what we see on just the prices. And the other thing is, of course, is user numbers as well. A lot of people talk about sort of what's happening in sort of some titles like Axie Infinity, where they compare it to peak numbers and they say it's dropped. And Axie Infinity is still doing okay. But what's also interesting is that the entire ecosystem has now multiple gaming titles that all of them actually have, monthly active users that are close to 1 million users each, right? So in other words, we've gone past the dependency on just one or two games and metaverses that do well. There's many more of them that actually have active users and strong activity in the space. So we've just become more diversified, which I think is healthier as a result, right? So the ecosystem continues to grow. And I think because we've become so accustomed to surrendering all of our data, we don't know what it's worth. It reminds me a little bit back in the day, in the early days of the internet, when people didn't understand, why would I want to share information on the internet? And why would I want to read stuff on the internet? It's just easier to read it in the newspaper, and it's just easier to read it in the magazine because it's beautiful. I can hold it, right? Of course, today everyone reads everything online. But why do we do it online? Because it's more efficient, because it's faster, because I get real-time information, because I can, people can't sort of information arbitrage me on something that's real time. Whereas if I get it in the newspaper, I might get the news 1 week later, or 5 days later, or maybe 1 month later. I don't know, right? So that removed that. And now basically in Web3, really, it's been about data arbitrage, right? In Web2, the data really belongs to the platforms. They derive all the value. And because we don't understand the value of data, we give it away. I like it a little bit to sort of imagine 1,000 years ago, if we discovered oil in our home, in our backyard. We're like, I don't know, what is this worth? It's worth nothing. We'll give it away because you don't have the technology and the machinery to turn oil into energy, into all these valuable things you could do. But today, because we know oil is valuable, if you discover oil in your backyard, you're not going to give it away. You're going to say, you can have my oil, but I'll charge you for it. I want something for it. And that's exactly the same way to look at data. Data to us is so valuable because it is our data that actually enables things like ChatGPT. I mean, if there was no data that ChatGPT could mine, there wouldn't be any ChatGPT. There would be no self-driving cars, and we wouldn't have, Instagram and Facebook and all these companies. really what makes them powerful is the fact that they have dominion over our data. And so that's something that I also try to explain to the community, that really it comes down to who controls the most valuable resource on Earth, which is basically, data. And in Web3, because of blockchain, we now have the ability to own a part of that data, meaning, we can now own a stake in the networks that we help construct. And that's basically why Web3 is called, the internet of ownership, which then translates itself to, some people call it the internet of value. And I understand that part. It's related because you can't have value until you have ownership, right? And that value needs to belong to all of us. It can't belong to just a few individuals or companies, which is what is happening in Web 2. So that was really the point of my talk. And it's gaining some traction. It is controversial because people who don't like crypto obviously have said negative things. But you know what? I mean, I guess you just have to keep soldiering on and make sure that people understand, because sometimes they don't appreciate how important it is for the future of the internet.
That's totally true. I mean, if you look at the early days of internet, it was being bashed, right? It was being talked about a lot on the traditional media. I recently saw a newsletter from one of the famous Web3 communities in the space, decentralized.co, which is owned by my friend Joel John. And they wrote a blog on the early days of internet, and they draw comparables to the current state of Web3, right? Because one thing that people needs to understand is Web3 is like a baby, right? And especially non-fungible token space is like a baby which is sort of crawling at the moment, and it definitely needs time to get up, walk slowly, and then run towards wherever they need to go, right? And people always take references from the peak points, right? People always say it is down by 90% since January, or the numbers from let's say one of the well-known NFT marketplaces, OpenSea, is down by so and so. But they also need to understand that the market is spread now, right? You have Magic Eden, you have Mintable, you have Nifty Gateway. So you have so many marketplaces that evolved, and people draw parallels only with the peak. And it is always cycles that happen, right? Not just in Web3, even in the traditional
Yes,
market.
in all businesses, correct. And
Exactly. Yeah.
also, we have to look at it from a longer lens. I mean, if you just literally sort of cherry pick, the last 9 months or 12 months, is one thing, but look at it over the last 3 years, right? And just analyze over the last 3 or 4 years what has happened, and the growth has been tremendous, right? So it's all relative. And as I said earlier, when you look at the user numbers and the traction, actually, it's higher than before. And that's very similar to how, when you think of the similar cycle back when the dot-com bubble burst in year 2000, you could see actually similar parallels, which is the valuations of these companies all were very low, but the actual products themselves and the utility of the products increased. And we saw that. We're like, well, more people are using their email, more people are posting on message boards, more people are sort of, wanting to build homepages, despite the fact that apparently the internet was all but going away, right? So I think this is the thing where, when you're in the space, like, all of us here, then we see what's actually happening and we're excited. But when you're outside of the space, right, and you're not in it, then it's just seems like, well, isn't it over already? I don't really know. And that's what I mean also in terms of we ourselves as a community need to step out and bring people into it as well, so they understand what's being built here.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, right? I mean, the early days of internet, people lost a lot of money, lost a lot of financial wealth on the internet because there were no such proper systems to safeguard users. And I'm glad that at bitsCrunch we are doing that, doing our own part in the Web3 space, where we detect scams in the Web3 space. And so good to see Animoca coming out and backing infrastructure projects. One good thing that I really like about Animoca's portfolio is you have backed n number of infra projects, which could potentially be the next set of Fortune 500 companies in the future, right? I'm not talking about now, probably in the future, in 10 years, in 20 years from now,
Yes.
these could potentially be the next big winners, right? So glad to know that part. And what I'm really interested in knowing is your piece of advice to founders like myself in such beer markets. What would be your advice be?
Well, okay. So first, I think there's a lot of things we want to talk about, but I
Yeah.
would say the one major thing that I always tell founders is that, if you're building for a purpose that is greater than your own, then no matter what circumstances and struggles you come through, you will kind of find a solution around it, right? Because you understand the importance of the mission and you understand how critical it is. And so you're willing to basically sort of, push it all the way to the edge. And, sometimes things don't work out. We understand that. But again, if you know what the broader mission is that you're building, then you will pivot, you will change around. You won't really completely change the goal of what you're doing, the higher goal, but you might change your approach and you might change the methodology because you'll constantly be thinking about it. And this is, I think, the sort of the reason why I like to focus on this, because obviously execution, is important, and, skill is important, and, intelligence, and yes, of course, all of this is important. But none of that really seems to matter if you're not occupied on this, basically, 24/7 in your mind, right? In other words, if you don't go to bed thinking about, what you're trying to solve for the world or for what it is that you're building, if it's not top of your mind, right, then it's very difficult. It's very difficult, especially during a bear market, because in a bull market, right, you have some luxuries in terms of the capital and the financing and but actually in the bear markets, the true test of the entrepreneurial qualities come out because then you're actually dealing in a market that is, challenged all the time. And which means that no matter how well things are going for you, you're basically always sort of sitting and thinking about scenarios. You're always thinking about potential threats and being paranoid about what could happen. And certainly in our industry, there's been many things that happened that none of us actually could even forecast. And so we had to be flexible and adjust based on that, right? I mean, if you think about the last 18 months, all the crap that has happened in our industry by, really bad actors, everyone's affected. And we had to all adjust, be flexible as a result of that. So I think this is really, really important. The other thing I would say, particularly for Web3, for Web3 founders, is building across this and acknowledging that actually we're building for a shared network effect. So this is a really important ethos for Animoca because the shared network effect means that we are building something that is going to be beneficial for others in a manner that we may not fully control, which is very different from, I guess, the classic Web2 way of thinking of sort of zero-sum outcomes of how do I become a monopoly, right? But if you think about, for instance, if you're building on Ethereum as an example, right, you're not going to be able to monopolize Ethereum, right? Because at the end of the day, if you build a really successful dApp on Ethereum, everyone who owns Ethereum will benefit as well, right? And so it effectively rebalances the network effects and shares them across and has these sort of amazing, I would say, anti-monopolistic qualities around it, which really is what draws us to it. And the kind of founders I believe that understand this really well and appreciate that, I think are the ones who are going to succeed in this long term. Because of course there are people, because of the way that capital forms, you can also have opportunities to sort of let's say try to extract from the network, very aggressively, and we've seen some of that in the past. But those are not recipes for long-term success, right? Meaning that because once you've extracted from the network really badly, the network won't necessarily welcome you back in. It's really hard to do that. So again, I think, and this is part of what blockchain is all about, which is there is a record, there's a history, right, and there's proof, right. And so as the history of blockchain continues and continues to extend and expand over time, so does essentially effectively your reputation, your goodwill, and your intentions. And that's something that in some ways I think is very powerful as well. So acknowledging that, I think. So I do believe that Web3 has a way of redrawing the way that we think of entrepreneurship and the way that we think of funding. So that's one of the reasons why we've funded so many companies, because we're not looking to find the one or two biggest winners in the space. We're looking to build an ecosystem and we're looking to support that ecosystem. Of course, we're not able to invest in everything, right? But we're certainly hoping to sort of support and grow an ecosystem that broadly will then benefit everyone. And so as a result, Animoca, with its investment portfolios and the company it's building, has become a little bit of a quasi index of Web3, which is maybe unintended, but certainly has become a little bit of that effect as well.
I mean, absolutely great. Talking about your recent success, Mochaverse, one last topic that I would like to touch upon here, because
Of
people
course.
think that funding is scarce, nobody is deploying capital right now, and we come up with the news saying Mochaverse has raised $20 million. Come on, twenty
Yes.
million dollars is definitely a big amount even in this market. And
Yeah.
any thoughts on the recent funding achieved?
Yeah. So first of all, we as Animoca have made many investments during the bear market this year anyway. But separately speaking, 20 million from some of the sort of biggest investors in Web3 is a pretty good endorsement. And what we're building in Mochaverse is basically a way in where holders of our NFTs in the future of the network that we're building can actually sort of participate broader in the Animoca ecosystem. So we've demonstrated that, for instance, with DAO governance, with things like, for instance, the way that Mochaverse holders can use a part of our token reserves to vote on things like Bitcoin, for instance. So that's obviously been one very sort of powerful effect. But the second thing also really is it demonstrates that when if there's good projects out there, then you can get funded. And I think a lot of people like to talk about how there's no money in the ecosystem. That's not true at all. In fact, as I said, the whole asset space in Web3 is $1 trillion plus. But just because some projects don't get funding doesn't mean that there isn't capital around. So I think certainly Mochaverse has demonstrated that. But there's many other projects that get funded too. So I would say, it's not nearly as bad as it was like 4 or 5 years ago. There was zero funding. Like there was literally no funding available for companies like us at the time. So it's not the same. And part of the reason, by the way, is that you've got other pockets of capital, like for instance the DAOs that I spoke of, that now are sitting on about $17 billion or plus of reserves, which can be deployed for investment. I mean, just think about that as just one example, right, of where you could sort of potentially raise capital from for your projects, independent of the traditional sort of VC cycles. And I think the other thing that's also sometimes happens is that people sometimes go for the shiny new thing, right? Which is, the shiny new thing is AI.
Yeah.
But I think what most people also don't appreciate is that AI and Web3 are absolutely intertwined. They're both digitally native constructs. We believe very strongly that actually independent sort of AI agents, they're going to be trading with each other, for instance, and they're going to be transacting, with each other and with other people. And what are they going to transact with? They're going to transact in crypto. They're not going to transact in fiat and bank accounts and so on. They can't, for instance, right? And how do we protect our digital property rights? How do we protect sort of knowing what maybe my art is or what my content creation is like? How do we do that? Well, we do it on blockchain, actually, right? Because there's no way that we as humans are going to be able to sort of protect our and know what our sort of intellectual property rights sort of abuses have been from a human perspective. We just can't do that quickly enough. But from a computational blockchain perspective, it can do that in real time. It can also reward basically people who use their IP in real time too. So I see Web3 and AI very intertwined. So it's a good example, I think, of where actually the markets collide, but people
Mhm.
don't yet appreciate it. But I think eventually when they do, people will come back to acknowledging that they're actually sort of complementary.
Yep, absolutely. I mean that's what we have seen in the past, right? In the past cycles, people miss something, miss the boat, and then they try to catch up. So I expect the same in this cycle and the coming
Of
cycles
course.
as well. So wonderful insights, and then now I would love to move to the last segment of our show, a rapid fire
Sure.
segment, where I would
Okay.
really need short and crisp answers from you, which is what the doctors order. So going by
Okay.
that, the first question: what is your favorite physical activity, Art?
Oh, I would say my favorite physical activity is probably hiking. I like to hike in the mountains and so on. Part of the reason is that, and I also, often, if I manage to be back in Hong Kong, I'll hike. Sometimes with family, sometimes by myself, with my dog. It's a I wouldn't call it meditative, but it does give you a sense of perspective. Also, when you walk amongst big mountains, it just is a good reminder as to, who you are, right? And I remember an experience when I was basically trekking, the base camp trail, the Everest base camp trail, and the massives of the Himalayas are just so incredible, and it just sort of it's majestic, and it gives you this really strong sort of humbling perspective as well. It sort of says, yes, you can build all sorts of things, but this is nature, right? This is where you are, and it's also something that is very reflective as well. I find it a very peaceful environment where you can think about things, because one of the things that often happens to many of us, especially as entrepreneurs, is we sometimes don't have enough time to think, right? We are just doing, which is true, and we have to. It's urgent, and everything needs to be done yesterday. But you do need to take some time off to reflect and think. And people do this in different ways. Some people meditate, some people go for walks, some people just literally sort of lock themselves up in a room and just, ruminate, right? And the way I do it is I basically go hike in the mountains, and I basically get to think as I walk. I get to reflect.
Good. I mean, absolutely. That shows the importance of how you should manage your work life, right? I mean, that is key here in this digital era. And part of the reason I believe is also because of you grown up in Vienna, which is closer to the Alps, right? So yeah, good to hear that you're continually doing that. And how does a typical day look for you, Yat? Because people wondering, a lot of stuffs are on your plate, right? You have a lot of
Mm.
acquisitions, you have a lot of investments on the table, you have a lot to do than a normal layman who is out there. So how does a typical day look like for you?
Well, I can't say that my day is structured in a typical sense, only because of the fact that I do travel a lot. But obviously, in between having to do work-related matters, obviously now currently I'm in Dubai, so I have speaking engagements and I'm meeting with people, for instance, as well, strategic conversations. But I would say one of the things that maybe some people say about me is that it doesn't seem that I sleep a lot. Right? So in other words, I do pack more in a day than I would say at least most people that I know of, because I really don't need that much sleep comparatively speaking. And I think it comes from a number of routines. So perhaps one of the routines that does help me is that I do exercise. Like if I can't hike or something, because I'm in Dubai and there's not many places to hike, right? Then obviously first thing I do in the morning is I go into the gym and I run and I do exercise, and that's how I start my day, right? And that's kind of important for me, because that gives me essentially the fuel and energy. And then the rest of the day stuff happens. Generally, if I can, I try, but this doesn't always work. If it's a typical work day, I try to deal with the most difficult things in the start of the day and the more fun things at the end of the day. That's an ideal. It doesn't always happen this way. But the thinking is that, you're refreshed and you are able to deal with tough challenges in the day, but you want to end the day with some more fun things and things that inspire you a bit more, so that you basically can I guess I wouldn't say relax, but feel fulfilled. But again, as I said, it's an ideal. It never quite works this way, at least for me. And so I think the biggest mindset that I think I need to have is that I need to be flexible. So sometimes, when there's crises like, with the FTX situation, I can't say that there were many pleasant moments at all
Yep.
during long periods of time. Just have to deal with it, right? And then you need some time, obviously, for yourself. But generally speaking, you just have to fight through all the challenges. It helps support your portfolio companies through difficult times. Understand what's going on, and then also the purpose as well, right? Like, for instance, because of what happened a year and a half ago, we ended up becoming more vocal. We ended up going to the market more. We ended up talking more about the space to let people know that Web3 isn't about FTX, right? Web3 is about much more than that. And
Yep.
so that meant we had to do more, which wasn't part of our plan. We had to basically be more vocal. We had to go to more conferences. We also had to, we felt, inspire more people around why you're here, right? Because a lot of people were like, oh, damn, some of them were getting disheartened, and some of them were feeling, a little bit lost. So I think, and many of us, it's not just us, many industry leaders have done the same thing. What I'm just saying is that there's a responsibility that comes with that. So we had to go out and we sort of do that as well. So, we had to be flexible in a market that is changing so rapidly. I don't think there is a classic formula, except for the fact that in my case, I do exercise every day.
Perfect. I mean, one little story that I would like to tell the audience is the PR announcement that we made for bitsCrunch back in 2021. So everything was set. The announcement of funding was set to go live on a Monday, and they were coming back to me and asking for a investor quote. And then whom did they ask for? They asked from you, Yat Siu from Animoca, because they were your lead investors. And I was like, come on, it's a Friday. We just have a weekend in between. I guess it's tough. And they were like keeping me hanging. They wanted me to push. They wanted me to try. I just dropped an email hoping for the best. And to my surprise, I got a response within 24-48 hours. And what I'm talking about is early 2022, peak of the bull market. And this literally shows how flexible you were and your team was. So thanks for that. And one last question: what's your favorite city and why? Tricky one.
Favorite city? Ooh. I mean, look, Hong Kong is home. And so again, it's hard for me to say favorite city, but certainly Hong Kong is a city that I would definitely want to highlight as one of my favorite cities. And not only because I live there, my family is there, and it's our headquarters, but also because Hong Kong has now really embraced Web3. If you think about it, right? Hong Kong has basically put policies forward around supporting Web3. They've given licenses out for exchanges. They've basically allowed for retail crypto trading amongst the most popular tokens. And despite the fact that there's been some setbacks in terms of some scandals and frauds, as sometimes that happens, they continue to be supportive of the industry. I myself sit on the Web3 task force, basically which was set up by the Hong Kong government to basically more sort of growth in Web3 and development of Web3 in Hong Kong. So yes, so I would say, outside of, all of these other reasons, and for personal reasons, I think Hong Kong is a great place to be.
Yep. Great. Thanks, Yad. Wonderful talking to you. Would be a pleasure having you again on the show sometime in the future. But tremendous insights, wonderful, and lovely insights for the founders, for the builders. Any parting thoughts? Any last thoughts for the builders in the space?
So, especially for Web3 builders, one of the things that I think is important for people to understand outside of what we said earlier is that blockchain is not just a technology. And I think you know this already. And one of the reasons why it's so controversial for some people is because even if they don't understand it, there is a sense of sort of political belief or sort of structural belief embedded in the technology, right? I mean, I think of blockchain as a political system, right? If you think about DAOs, if you think about governance, if you think about the economics attached, it's a fairly free market liberal type of sort of philosophy in terms of economics. It is a very freedom loving property rights type of philosophy as well when it comes to your assets on chain, for instance. And one of the things that I think the sooner we better appreciate and understand, I guess, what we're building in that lens, which is a bit more philosophical than just purely technical, I think the more apparent what it is that we're building becomes. Certainly, that's been my lens and the lens of some of our really successful founders. Because blockchain, why it's so controversial is because some people have struggled with capitalism, right? Capitalism is, in the past, it's always been viewed as an incredible positive force. But in recent times, because of the inequity that capitalism has created, particularly the shareholder form of capitalism, it's become a negative connotation. So when people look at Bitcoin, they don't see the technology. They don't see what it could be or its value potential in terms of what it means for our rights. They just see that it's a lot of money that they don't have. It seems unfair, right? And all these things. When you see the reactions that people have against crypto, it's emotional. It's not. It's not. It's not. It's not rational, right? Which is the issue, right? So to deal and why does it come? Why is it so irrational? because it's an emotion and it's a feeling that comes from sort of something that they don't believe in or they don't agree with. In the same way that people don't, not everyone agrees with capitalism being something positive, for instance. So so I think there is some of that sort of deeper thinking that we need to engage when we build in blockchain. It's not just about the product; it's about essentially some of those deeper meanings. And one of the big missions, I think, everyone in Web3 has to think about is how we include more people financially. In other words, we're building products, but everything we do in Web3, the way that you onboard a Web3 user successfully, we think, comes with ultimately financial inclusion and therefore financial literacy. If there is no Web3 user, a true Web3 user, that is not financially somewhat literate, can't be in Web3 and have no idea. It doesn't work this way. But you know what? Most of the world actually doesn't know anything about money, a bank account, but they don't invest and they don't think about that. They're mostly in labor markets, and they live month by month or even less. How do they even have time to think about sort of things of value? And so this seems alien to them. So I feel like we need to do a better job at that. And acknowledging that is actually going to bring them in because we can explain to them why it's better for them. And that means we will have to play a part in education. So I think it behooves all of the founders in Web3 to sort of think of that as part of our roadmap.
Yep. Absolutely, Yat. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and you have already inspired a lot of people, inspiring a lot of people, and keep doing that. And then you have been a torch bearer for a lot of builders, founders, especially for people in Web3. So keep doing the good work, and pleasure talking to you, Yat. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
And thank you for having me.
Yep, pleasure.